Ever stood under a sky so wide your secrets felt small? Here on Cowboy Storytime, we ride the stories of the West campfire, truth's trail dust memories, saloon whispers, gritty humans sometimes messy. Every tale is a horizon to chase. Subscribe, pull up a stool, and maybe find a little courage for your own frontier. Cinder Ridge sits where three walls of lodgepole pine climb into red rock, and the fourth opens to a hard, endless prairie. The wind is never still. It rattles tin combs through sage rings the church bell, even when no hand pulls the rope. In the early light, a single ribbon of smoke lifts from a squat chimney on the north edge of town, thin as a thread pulled through dark cloth. Wren Calder lives in the scullery that fire forgot. The main house is a black jawbone teeth of charred beams nipping at the sky. She patched the scullery roof with scavenged planks and river mud, bent nails hammered straight on a flat stone. The chimney draws true. Each morning she feeds a twig of pitch to the coals, and the smoke rises stubborn and small. People in Cinder Ridge pretend not to look. Mothers pinch their children's shoulders and cross to the other side of the lane. Men lean on the porch rail at Ned Caro's store and let their talk fall quiet. Sheriff Kemp polishes the same brass star that never gets brighter. Pastor Whitlock preaches about stain and cleansing his voice, turning clean words into a weight. No one says her name, not when she can hear, but the wind carries it anyway. Wren keeps to the edges. She mends shirts and splits seams for coin that smells of iron and sweat. Her needle flashes in the window light. The thread tightens and bites the knot seats. In the yard, a row of beans clings to twine, stunted squash hunker in gritty soil. A few potatoes lie like stones waiting to be lifted. Cricket, her father's mule, drags a lame leg with offended dignity and eats carrot ends from her palm. The stories are slower than winter and stick longer. Jem Doyle was 17 and carved her a little bird out of willow. He took it down to the Madison when the thaw came ragged and wild. The river was brown and loud. He stood on a raft tied with fence wire and looked back at her with a grin too big for his face. The rope snapped. The raft turned like a leaf. His cap came up once, then not again. 2 days later, the bird washed onto the bank with a splintered wing. Sam Hargreave left pelts on her step when the nights went blue with cold. He wore a hat rimmed with grease and moved quiet, a man who knew when to set his weight and when to let the snow hold it. He walked the Gallatin with a rifle that never missed, until an old cinnamon bear found him bending over a sprung trap. They brought back a torn sleeve and a boot with the heel chewed. In the saloon, men drank and shook their heads. In church, the pastor spoke of signs. Tom Vickers learned to talk faster than he learned the country. He bragged about assayers and letters from back east. He laughed at Gushenit, at edges, at anything that asked for respect. He took a claim up by Red Ladder Ridge, 100 feet of bad air between ledge and wash, and his chestnut came home with white on its eye and no rider. Tom lay at the bottom in a shape that did not look like a man. The ridge kept its red. After that, the town found a language that fit how it wanted to feel. Wren walked in for flour and salt. Ned Caro set the bag on the counter and slid it without touching her hand. His smile was thin and cracked like old paint. Someone spat tobacco into the stovebox and missed. The room held its breath until she stepped back outside. Even the flies sounded loud in the quiet she left behind. Silence became a kind of coat. Wren wore it until it shaped itself around her ribs. She wrote, but not about omens. She wrote about weather that smelled of rain and iron. She wrote about Cricket's hoof, the way the frog softened when the creek ran high. She wrote the day the first bean flower opened pale as milk, and the day a frost took it again. The journal's leather is oiled with use, her script tight and even. She does not write about the curse. She refuses to give a lie a second life. Sometimes when the wind falls asleep for a breath and the pine pitch warms, another scent lifts from the ruined beams of the old house. Kerosene faint and sour caught, where a joist split and ran like candle fat before cooling. It is a ghost of a smell. Wren sets her jaw and opens the window wider. The world outside is full of clean things. Sap Creek water, the dull comfort of wool heated near a fire. On Sundays, she sits where her father built a bench plank cut by thumbprints long gone. The church bell throws sound across the scrub, and the women file in with their Bibles pressed like loaves to their chests. Pastor Whitlock's voice turns steady and low, as if he is telling a secret that belongs to him and God alone. He talks about fire. He talks about washing. He does not say why there are men who prosper. He does not say how a girl could set a river to swelling or ask a ridge to shrug off a man. The town has old bones. Along the fence line, Wren will find a survey stake half rotted, burned into it with a hot brand, the letters gone soft with weather. She straightens it out of habit and props it with a wedge of stone. It feels like writing a grave marker. For a moment she cannot breathe. Cricket bumps her shoulder with a bridleless head, and the breath comes back on its own. Once a week, when the sky is low and the grass holds the nights wet, Wren walks the creek and checks where the bank undercuts. In one pool, the water is tea-colored with tannin and cold enough to numb her wrist. A trout holds where the current curls dark, back pale flicker of belly. She stills, then smiles. The fish glides into shadow and does not show again. The world can choose to keep something for itself. Across town, a boy with hair like straw points at the chimney. His mother draws him close. She never looks and speaks to the street in general, as if talking to dust. "Do not make a habit of staring," she says. "Habits shape a life." Wren pulls linen from a trunk and finds her mother stitching on a hem even and small. She runs a finger under it, and a thread gives just slightly memory, holding fast. The needle she uses now came from a soldier who paid with it when his shirt ripped and he was short on coin. The metal warms quickly in her hand. She threads it, clamps the free end with her teeth, and starts a new seam that will hold against work and weather. Late September draws the light thin and purple. The aspens along the draw have already turned 1,000 small coins shivering on narrow stems. In the distance, a line of clouds sits on the teeth of the ridge, as if testing them. The smell changes, less dust, more stone. Wren sweeps ashes away from the firebox lip and feeds in a stick. The smoke lifts, twists, then steadies. She listens to the wind searching, feels the scullery settle around her, hears cricket stamp once in the lean-to, as if saying, "Here, here, here." She takes the notebook to the table and writes the day and the weather in a tight hand. She sharpens the pencil with a paring knife and lays the curl of cedar on the sill. When she looks up, the ribbon of smoke is rising clean and narrow, a line you could follow with 2 fingers from the hearth to the pale belly of the sky. She breathes in the warm, resinous air and ties off her thread with a square knot she could make in the dark. Outside, the bell gives one slow swing and stops. Inside, the fire sounds like a clock. The wind turned cold enough to taste. It ran through the pines and flattened the grass, carried a sharp tang that lifted the hair on Wren's arms. Light went thin and bruise-colored. Cricket shifted in the lean-to and struck a hoof once, as if to warn the air itself. Wren swung the shutters over the small window and set the bar across them. In the scullery, the firebox glowed. She stoked it, fed in a split of resinous pine, and watched the ribbon of smoke twist once, then climb. She set the kettle. The first raindrops ticked on the patched roof. Then the sky opened, and rain came in sheets that made the yard vanish into gray. Something moved where the track from town met the trees. A horse and a man, both soaked through, both moving like the storm was shoving at their backs. The horse stumbled. The man stepped down and limped it forward, his hand to the front leg, his hat pulled low. He paused at the ruin of the main house, stared once into the black ribs, then came to the scullery door and knocked with his knuckles firm and steady. Wren lifted the rifle, eased the latch, and opened just enough to show an eye and the oiled barrel. Rain ran from the brim of his hat and curved off his scar. He took the hat off, and the rain plastered his dark hair to his skull. "Ma'am," he said, "my horse has thrown a shoe. I am lost in this rain. I am only asking a roof for him. Your lean-to if you have one." "There is a lean-to," she said. "There is a mule in it. No room for a man." "The horse is what matters," he said. "Thank you." He turned to go. The rain roared on the roof. Wren hesitated. She kept the rifle ready but pushed the door wider. "I have fire," she said. "If you have coffee, it can be made." He looked back at her with a steady kind of surprise. "I do. In my saddlebag. Enough to share." "Bring the bag in," she said. "Leave the rifle outside." He tied the rifle to the tack, led the bay to the lean-to, and spoke low into its ear until the horse stopped blowing and stood. Cricket lifted her head, gave the stranger an indifferent look, and put her nose back in the hay. He took his saddlebags and came back through the rain boots, leaving dark prints on the wet earth. Inside, he stayed just inside the door. Water ran from his coat and struck the packed dirt in a slow patter. The scullery was small and warm. The smell was wood smoke, damp wool, a hint of soap. Wren hooked a black pot over the fire and tipped in water. He crouched by the hearth without reaching across her ground and unwrapped a small tin of coffee and a twist of salt pork. "Name is Ezra Kane," he said, voice low, like he had not used it much in days. Wren called her, she answered. She did not lower the rifle until he set the coffee tin near the coals and put both palms open on his knees. The rain beat time on the roof. The kettle pushed at its lid and rattled. Ezra pinched coffee into the water with careful fingers, then set the pot where the heat licked but did not boil. He moved in the way of a man who had learned to keep every motion quiet. The scar along his cheek was a pale rope that caught the firelight. He watched the brew darken, then poured a taste into a spoon and sipped it like it might bite. He nodded once, poured a cup, and slid it across the hearthstone to where Wren could reach without stepping close. She did not take her eyes off him as she wrapped her hand around the tin and brought it to her mouth. The coffee was bitter and deep and alive. It ran heat into her chest and eased something she pretended was not there. He poured his own. They drank. The quiet between them was thick, but it was not empty. "You live in the part the fire left," he said after a while. It was not a question. "Yes," she said. "The chimney pulls right. The roof holds if you do not look at it too hard." He let out a breath that might have been a laugh. The bay had a bad step long before the rain. I pressed him too far. "The bluffs turn me around. Every ridge looks like its brother when the cloud drops." "You came from the South Fork," she said. "Your coat is full of burrs from the low swale. The North Creek runs on gravel. It will not hold a print in rain." He glanced at the hem of his own coat and picked off a seed head, then set it on the stone beside him, as if the small act deserved care. "You know the ground," he said. "I walk it," she said. "It holds me up when it has a mind to." He looked around the small room without letting his gaze feel like a hand. A narrow cot, a table made from a door laid on trestles, a line of beans outside the window, their leaves shiny with rain, a mule that breathed slow and damp through the plank wall. On the table, a leather journal with the corner softened from many turnings, a needle thrust into the wood at the edge to keep from losing it. There was a second smell under the pine smoke so faint he might have imagined it, kerosene caught in old timbers and woken by weather. "You have been through this way," he said. "Cinder Ridge." He did not name the church or the porch or the eyes that watched. She blew across the rim of the cup. "People talk," she said. "They talk." "Where I came through too," he said. "I do not put much weight on words that grow best in rooms where no one looks another in the eye." Her mouth moved like she meant to hide a smile and decided against it. She set the empty cup near him. He refilled it without asking, then added a piece of salt pork to a small pan and held it at the heat until the fat sang. The smell settled around them like a blanket. He took a knife and split the pork. He pushed half to her, tip of the blade turned to himself. "Eat," he said. "It is better than being hungry." She tasted it. Grease and salt and smoke. She made no sound, but the angle of her shoulders lowered by the smallest degree. "You are a soldier," she said. "You move like someone who expects a wall to fall or a gun to speak." "I was," he said. He tapped the scar with a dry finger as if to say the history had already written itself. "Not now. I am looking for quiet." "You will not find it in town," she said. He did not answer. The rain rattled the panes of the shutter. He raised the pot and set it aside to cool. The fire popped, and a spark skittered across the stone and died. "You can sleep in the loft of the lean-to," she said after a time. "There are old blankets. It is dry. The mule will not argue if you keep your feet away from hers." "Thank you, Miss Calder." "It is not kindness," she said. "It is a roof. There is a difference." He stood and gathered his saddlebags. He wiped the handle of the cup before setting it where it had been. He hesitated at the door. "I will look at your horse in the morning light," she said. "If he will let me check the hoof, I have a rasp." He nodded once and went back into the rain. The night ran loud and long. Wind pushed at the seams. Wren sat with her back to the wall, and her journal opened pencil steady lines of script that kept their order even when the world did not. When sleep came, it was light. She woke twice and put another sliver of pine to the coals, saw the glow find itself again, listened for the animals' counted breaths. Dawn came hard and clean, the kind that leaves every edge cut out of the air. The sky was rinsed to a pale blue, and the bluffs wore a thin net of cloud that lifted as the sun cleared. Ezra climbed down from the loft with straw in his hair and stiffness in his shoulders. He brought the bay out and stood. The animal in the clear light ran a hand down the leg, found the missing nail, and fashioned a shim with a bit of pine and a length of wire from his kit. It would not hold forever, but it would carry a mile or 5 without pulling more tendon. He walked to the scullery door and knocked once. Wren opened it at once. She looked like she had slept only enough to count as sleep. Her hair was braided back tight. She held a small bundle wrapped in cloth. "You left this," she said. She put the bundle in his hand. "Bacon. Cooked." He felt the warmth through the cloth. Her fingers brushed the back of his knuckles. She did not pull away. He tried to hand back the cloth. "Keep it," she said. "I have rags." He looked past her shoulder to the room. It was neat and bare and whole in the way a scar can be whole. He put his hat on, turned to the yard, and considered the land. The creek ran a clear line north. The pines crowded a shoulder of rock. The ground rose to a shelf where a man could see smoke from here and from the next draw. If you are riding out, she said, stay high. The South Fork slides in rain and takes a horse with it. He studied the ridge she pointed to. He traced the run of the creek with his eyes, set the shape of it in his head. They will see you leaving here, she said. Their talking will grow teeth. Be careful. The words were simple. The weight of them was not. Ezra nodded. And you, Miss Calder. He stepped into the clean morning and mounted. The bay blew, then settled. Ezra did not look back. The scullery smoke rose in a narrow line behind him, thin and persistent. He rode out along the high ground, the kind that holds under a horse, and the sound of the creek kept him company until the trees took it. By noon the rain had burned itself out. The streets of Cinder Ridge shone in patches, where the sun found them, and mud pulled at hooves with a wet sigh. Ezra tied the bay to the hitch outside the land office, wiped a palm on his coat, and stepped inside. The air smelled of chalk and stale coffee. Wall maps were tacked to rough boards, all lines and squares and looping blue for creeks. The clerk, a thin man in a green visor, looked up without moving his head. Beetle, he said, as if the name were a gate. You after pasture or timber? Land, Ezra said. North of the bluffs, section that rides the creek. Beetle slid a map across the desk with 2 fingers. His nail tapped a blank square that sat between pines and stone. That one has no road and less sense. Nobody files there. Hard country. No neighbors worth the name. Ezra set a small leather pouch on the desk. The gold coins made a bright, neat sound that did not match the room. I will take it. Beetle's eyes ticked toward the window. Across the street, Ned Caro leaned in his doorway and chewed at an old toothpick. Boone Sutter sat on a barrel and watched the town like it might break if he stared long enough. The church bell across the way blew a tired note. Beetle lowered his gaze and took up a pen. Name, Ezra Kane. Beetle wrote slow as if each letter were a chore. He lifted the visor with a knuckle to see better. He pressed a seal into a damp ribbon and slid the paper forward. Sign, the square is yours on paper at least. Ezra signed. The nib scratched. He folded the deed and tucked it inside his coat. He took the pouch back and left 2 coins on the desk for fees. Beetle palmed them without looking pleased. On the porch the air smelled of sun on wet wood. Caro's smile sat thin on his face. Neighbor now, are you Mr. Kane? He said. Fine spot. Quiet. Some folks call it too quiet. Boone spat in the dust and watched the spit turn into mud. He grinned at Ezra's scar like it was a thing he owned. Ezra put a hand to the bay's neck and stepped down into the street. The horse blew and settled. He swung up and rode without a word. The north country opened slow. Pines took the light in tall green walls. The creek ran busy in clear glass over gravel. Ezra stood in the stirrups to see the lay. A shoulder of rock lifted to a flat shelf with wind in view. It looked like a place a man could raise 4 walls and see trouble in time to stand up to it. He staked a small canvas under a bend of spruce, set a stone ring for a fire, and cut a length of willow to peg one corner. He took out his knife and started a kit of pegs and lashings. The smell of sap stuck to his hands and would not leave. Late in the day, the sound of hooves came from the road out of the town. Ezra set his palm on the bay's jaw and watched the path. A black coat came first, then a white collar, then a book held to a pale chest. Pastor Whitlock pulled up and sat the saddle like a man carved from oak. His eyes took in the tent. The axe leaned near the small square of cleared ground. His voice came out smooth from too much use. Mr. Kane, he said, you have made a choice of neighbors. Ezra set a whetstone to the axe and pulled it slow. He did not look up. I bought a square of ground. That is all. The pastor nodded to the creek as if the water could back him up. This valley has seen tragedy. We are a people who remember. There are stains that soak to the root. A man fresh to our hills should be warned. Ezra lifted the axe to the light, looked at the edge, and drew the stone again. I have seen stain, he said. It was not in the dirt. The pastor's smile stayed where it had been set. He watched the line of smoke that rose from far down the draw. It was thin as thread, and it marked the place of a woman the town had already named. The pastor's jaw made a small motion, then stilled. The Lord cleans, he said softly, sometimes with rain, sometimes with fire. Ezra set the axe aside and stood. He wiped his hands on a rag. You have said your piece. I have work to do. Whitlock's face did not change, but his hands pressed the reins until the leather creaked. He turned his horse with a touch and rode back the way he had come, coat flapping where the wind found it. North of the draw, Wren stood at her fence line and looked at trouble that had nothing to do with talk. An old aspen had gone over in the last gust and taken 10 feet of rails down with it. Coyote prints ran like stitches through the gap. Deer had already found the beans. The leaves were ragged wet and bitten. She fetched a hatchet and tried to drag the aspen with a loop of rope. The trunk would not shift. Cricket watched her with a patient eye that said she was seen. Wren worked until the light went. She tied a strand of twine across the worst of it, more symbol than barrier, then went inside and set water for tea her coin could not spare. Night came clean and cold. In the pines near Ezra's tent, an owl spoke once and fell silent. He shouldered the axe and walked the line that marked his south edge. The broken fence on Wren's side showed itself in the last light. He stood and looked at the tracks until he knew where the animals liked to pass. He cut the aspen into rounds and split one into slabs he could set as braces. He stripped willow from the creek and worked it into ropes that would pull and hold without cutting. He lashed the rails tight. He set a cross brace and wedged it until it took a man's weight. He tied every knot like a thing that would be leaned on. His fingers went numb, then warm, again, then numb. The sky went purple. The knot at the end of the last lashing sat neat and true. He stepped back into the trees and let the night have the sound of his boots. At first light, Wren came with a bucket for the lean-to. She stopped in the doorway and looked at the fence. She did not move. The gap was gone. The rails were set where they belonged. The willow lashings shone pale in the dawn, and the knots were small and sure. She put the bucket down and went to the fence. She touched a knot and felt the turn of the willow under her finger. She looked left then right, caught in the old habit of scanning for eyes. A jay shouted from the spruce like a scold. The yard held its breath. She took her hand back and did not know what to do with it, so she held it at her side and closed it. The day drew the town into Sunday clothes. Wren sat on the bench outside her broken house while the bell carried a low pulse over the flats. She could hear Whitlock's voice like a rope being pulled on a well bucket. He spoke of sifting and threshing. He spoke of what does not belong and how it is cast out. He spoke of fire as if it were a tool a man could hold without burning. He did not say her name. He let the congregation say it for him in the privacy of their own mouths. When the people came out, skirts brushed dust off the steps in small fans. Men stood with hands in pockets and eyes on the ground. Someone laughed too loud and then stopped. Children were not allowed to run. Everyone looked at the road north at least once. News traveled the way water does, finding every low place. By evening, it was understood that the stranger had bought land at the edge of the Calder place. Some said he was crazy. Some said bewitched. Boone Sutter said both and grinned while he said it. Ned Caro counted coins twice and still could not make them add up clean. There was a second gift of silence as dusk fell. Wren swept the floor and set a pinch of salt on the sill and stood with her hands on the back of the chair, not ready to sit and not ready to move. The knock did not come. The night hung and then dropped. At dawn, a burlap sack leaned against her door as if it had walked there on its own. Wren opened the door slow and looked down. The sack was tied with a piece of willow. She nudged it with her bare toe. It did not jump. She bent, untied the knot, and opened the mouth. Oats shone inside, clean and dry. Cricket's soft bray from the lean-to came as if from another room. Beside the sack lay 2 rabbits skinned and washed, wrapped in damp leaves and tied with string. They smelled like creek water and cold meat. Heat ran up the back of Wren's neck and settled behind her eyes. Gratitude came like an ache. She did not want it. Gratitude wanted to make a promise, and she had none to give back. She gathered the rabbits and the oats and dragged them inside. She set the bar on the door and stood with her back to it for a long time. Across the creek, the axe found its rhythm. Ezra set his shoulders to the work and kept his eyes on the line where trees became sky. Smoke from his small fire went up in a straight line and then bent where wind found it. In the scullery, Wren tied a net of twine for beans with hands that had learned how to make a line hold. The town went on speaking in the places it liked to speak. The 2 of them worked at the edges and did not look for approval. The bruised clouds that had sat on the ridge all week pulled apart and showed a thin blue that had not been there at dawn. A breath of scent came from the ruin of the main house, kerosene gone thin and almost imaginary. Wren opened a shutter to let the room take in cleaner air. The ribbon of smoke from her chimney rose against the morning, narrow and stubborn, exactly as much as she would allow. Monday came bright and cold enough to harden mud to a skin. Ezra wrote a list in a blunt hand, folded it once, and slid it into his coat. The bay blew steam when he tightened the cinch. He rode into Cinder Ridge with the creek at his back and the bell quiet. Ned Caro's store sat with its windows clouded by flour dust and breath. A potbelly stove ticked inside. The air smelled of coffee grounds, molasses, and oil that had soaked into floorboards for years. A row of jars held hard candy, the color of old glass. A barrel of nails sat open like a well. Boone Sutter leaned by the cracker barrel with his thumb hooked in his belt and a piece of tobacco working his jaw. Ned stood behind the counter polishing a tin scoop that did not need it. Ezra took off his hat. He set the folded paper on the counter and smoothed it with 2 fingers. 30 pounds of nails, 2 sacks of flour, 5 pounds of salt, coffee, window glass 2 panes if they will ride safe, putty for the frames. Ned did not touch the paper. He slid it back an inch with 1 finger as if it were dirty. Stock is thin, Mr. Kane. Harvest coming. Folks with families to feed. I cannot fill that. Ezra looked past him. Flour sacks rose to a man's chest against the back wall. The nail barrel was heavy enough to bow the slats. A case of coffee tins sat on a shelf, with the top one turned to show the brand. I see flour, Ezra said. I see nails. I see coffee. Ned's smile got careful. Reserved, promised you might say. For who? For decent folk. Boone's voice came out raw and pleased. His eyes went to the scar and back. Not for a man that keeps company where he should not. Not for someone who lets himself be led by a girl that bends a town. Ezra looked at him once. The room felt smaller. He laid his palm flat on the counter and said nothing. Boone pushed himself off the barrel and came closer. He was a big man. His boots made the floor complain. He spat brown into the stove ash and missed by a thumb. He hooked his fingers into Ezra's list and tugged it away. How about I keep this, he said. Save you the trouble of wanting more than you need. Say it again, Ezra said. Boone's grin widened. Not for the likes of you. Not for a man sniffing after the Calder witch. The next motion was fast and simple. Ezra stepped in and put his right fist straight into Boone's throat. Not a swing. A hard, clean strike that drove voice and air back into the pipe it came from. The sound Boone made was not a word. He folded and staggered into a stack of tins. Peaches went down in a bright spill of syrup and paper labels. The floor turned sticky. Boone clawed at his own neck and knocked the stove poker over so it rang on the boards. Ned jerked and ducked for the shotgun under the counter. Ezra's hand shot across the wood and found Ned's wrist. He squeezed until bones ground together under skin. Ned's eyes went wide and wet. The shotgun clattered back to its place. We are going to do this right, Ezra said. His voice was even. I will pay. You will take it. You will not put your mouth on her name again. Not in my hearing, not in anyone's. Ned said nothing. His breath came quick through his nose. Ezra held on until he felt resistance drain out of the joint. He let go and reached across for the tin scoop. He walked behind the counter like it belonged to no one, and measured nails into a burlap sack until it pulled heavy in his hand. He took 2 flour sacks off the stack and shouldered them one at a time to the door. He set the salt and 3 tins of coffee on the counter and then carried them out. He moved in silence except for the weight speaking in his breath. Boone tried to stand. He made a low sound and sat back in the peaches. Ned cradled his wrist to his chest and watched Ezra go back and forth, with the calm of a man putting up wood for winter. Ezra returned for 2 narrow panes of glass. He chose the ones without scratches. He found a roll of window putty and a packet of wire nails in a drawer. He set everything in a neat line on the counter. He pulled a gold coin out of his pocket and set it spinning on the scarred wood. It danced in a bright circle and settled with a soft ring. For the lot, he said, and for the peaches. Ned licked his lips. His eyes dropped to the coin. He moved slow hand close to his body and covered the gold like it might jump away. He nodded and could not make words. Boone found his feet on the second try. His face had lost its color. He said something that was meant to be a threat and came out a rasp. Ezra turned his head and looked at him without expression. Boone closed his mouth. He held his throat with 2 fingers as if that would keep his breath from leaking. On the street, a few men stood with their hands in their pockets and watched without watching. The bell in the church gave one small sound as the rope settled. The sun had dried the first inch of mud and the small cracks had formed. Ezra loaded the last sack. He tied the glass in a sling so it would not clatter. He put his hat on and looked once at Ned. I will be by when the coffee runs out, he said. Keep your hands where they belong. He took the bay's rein and swung up. The horse shifted under the weight and took the bit steady. Ezra rode past the barber window with its striped pole, past the boards of the jail, where the paint was going soft, past the alley where old Finch slept away the day. The air tasted of sugar and iron. Wren heard the clop of hooves from the scullery. She did not go to the door. She stood by the window where a sliver between shutter and frame gave her an inch of street. She saw a shoulder, a brim, the sweep of a coat dark with damp. The bay's flank shone. 2 flour sacks sat like white ribs over the horse's spine. A long bundle wrapped in canvas rode one stirrup. Glass caught the sun and threw a blade of light on the ground. Ezra did not look at the scullery. He kept his eyes on the road north. Wren's breath fogged the shutter slit. She stepped back and felt the small room take her shape again. She set the kettle on and stood with her fingers on the edge of the table. The house made its small sounds. A drip from the roof into the bucket, Cricket's long sigh, the rattle of ash in the firebox when a coal collapsed. Old Mrs. Albright passed and then paused where she should not have. Wren heard the old woman's skirts hush against dry grass, heard the hush again as she moved on. The town carried the story the way it carried dust. It settled on things. It left a taste. Far to the north, the sound of chopping started and fell into a rhythm. Ezra's axe bit and bit again. In the yard beyond Wren's window, a line of beans held their own. She threaded a needle with cotton, pulled from a thimble's lip, and set to a tear in a shirt someone had left by her door with coins wrapped in paper. The shirt smelled of sweat and smoke. The thread slid and tightened. The knot seated. Outside, a fly circled the chimney once and lifted into the clean blue. The creek carried a colder sound that morning. Ezra walked into his camp with a length of sapling on his shoulder and stopped. The tent was cut to ribbons. The cordage lay in snarls. The lean fence he had set to dry plank had been shoved flat and scattered. His tool roll was gone. A heel had ground a wet boot print into the ash of last night's fire. He set the sapling down and stood very still. He did not speak. He gathered what could be gathered. He shook rainwater out of a blanket and hung it between 2 spruce. He cut a new ridgepole and set the canvas as a lean with no pretense of neatness. He found a small knife where it had been kicked under a root and wiped the blade on his sleeve. He fed a match to dry pitch and watched flame take. The smell of smoke climbed and drew true. Across the draw, Wren saw that smoke and felt a tightness like wire pull across her chest. She put on her heaviest boots and crossed the yard at a near trot. Cricket lifted her head, then dropped it again. Wren climbed the deer track through wet fern until Ezra's camp opened under the trees. She stopped at the edge. The ruin of the tent still clung to one stake like a skin. The small neatness he had kept was gone. Ezra sat on a stump with his rifle across his knees and his jaw set. The knuckles of his right hand were raw and pink, where the skin had split on something that did not move. "This is my fault," she said. The words came out harder than she meant. "I told you. You should go." He looked up. His eyes were the color of the creek when the sky is slate. "I am not going." "They will come again," she said. "They will not stop at canvas." "Then let them try a man that is awake," he said. She stepped closer, boots in the needles. "You do not understand this place." "I understand men," he said. He stood and checked the rifle out of habit. He set it down again because her face did not change. "I am done stepping back." Her throat moved once. Anger and fear rode up together and made a knot. She shook her head and left before she said anything she could not pull back out of the air. By midday, the sky lay low and heavy. Wren took Cricket into town because the flour sack at home felt empty when she lifted it. She tied the mule outside Carrow's and stood a long time with her hand on the door latch. Voices ran inside. Ned's soft talk, the rough scrape of Boone's laugh. She opened the door and stepped in. The room fell quiet like it had been waiting for a cue. Ned's face tilted careful and thin. Boone stood from the barrel and smiled with teeth that had been a fist away from breaking. A second man moved out of the corner where the stove stood. Pike Moran's shoulders wide, eyes small, as if they squinted for a living. Wren kept her eyes at the shelf where the flour sacks sat. She counted 4 with room left behind them. "Just flour," she said. "1 sack." Boone took 2 steps and blocked the way. He smelled of tobacco and syrup and the iron stink of a cut that had not scabbed. "Where is your soldier neighbor?" he asked. He had a trick voice now low from the hurt in his throat. "He might be hungry." Wren kept her voice even. "I do not know." Pike shifted and put his bulk in the other space she could have used. He reached out and caught a strand of her hair like he was checking a rope for strength. "It is smooth," he said. "Maybe that is where the luck lives." Wren drew back and his hand caught only the end. "Let me pass," she said. The words were soft, because that was where power sat. Boone laughed and stepped closer, or what he asked. "You going to look at me? You going to make me fall off a ridge?" A click carried in the room. that did not belong to the stove, or the door, or the cash drawer. It was the sound of a hammer easing back on a rifle that had been kept clean. Every shoulder in the room went still. Ezra stood in the doorway, with his hat brim low and his coat open. The Winchester lay easy in his hands, and the barrel lined up with Boone's belly. "You will move away from her," Ezra said. "You will not speak to her. You will not stand in her path. If I see you within 10 feet of her again, I will put a hole below your belt, so a doctor will not know what to sew first." Boone's hands went up without argument from his throat. Pike stepped back fast and found the corner with his shoulders. Wren did not look at Ezra. She watched Ned, who watched the coin drawer with a lost expression. Ezra did not shift. Boone looked for words and found none. He went sideways until the counter was between him and the rifle. Ezra's eyes did not change. He turned his head a fraction and spoke to Wren without taking his sight off Boone. "Take what you came for," he said. She did not move. Her body had started to shake a fine tremor under the skin. She hated that anyone could see it. She took one step, lifted a flour sack that was more weight than it should have been, and kept her eyes on the door. On the street, the air had the crackle of a crowd that does not want to be called a crowd. Wren threw the sack across Cricket's back and tied a knot without looking at her hands. Ezra came out behind her, the rifle at rest now, but not away. "You do not make this better," she said. Her voice had a cold edge. He had not heard it before. His mouth set. He said nothing. He lifted a second sack from his own horse, tied it to Cricket without asking, and put a coin under the twine. He turned and walked away with the rifle low and his shoulders square. Wren dug her heels into Cricket as if the mule were a horse that could run. The animal jogged into a clumsy trot and then gave up and walked. By the time she reached the yard, her breath came in hard pulls and her anger had burned down to a darker thing. She slid the sacks to the floor and stood over them like they might leave if she did not. Night fell in a way that felt thicker than it should. Ezra lit no fire in the open. He sat in the half-frame he had raised on the shelf above the creek and watched the dark turn the pines into a single shape. When the knock came, it was Knuckles on a beam, not his door. He turned and saw Wren in the doorway without a lamp. Her face looked carved out of something pale. "This is your fault," she said. He stood. She did not step back. "They will hurt you until you go," she said. "They will hurt me to make it quicker. If you had left me alone, it would have stayed quiet." "It was never quiet," he said. She hit him once with the flat of her hand against his chest, more sound than force. He caught her wrists because it was the only way to stop her breaking her hand on something that would not move. Her bones felt like the handle of a thin tool he could snap if he forgot himself. "Let me go," she said. The shake was back stronger now. "I hate that you make me look like this." "No," he said. "You hate that anyone sees you at all." Her eyes flashed at that. She pulled against his grip and then stopped. She looked up, and all the anger in her face went to a place behind her eyes. It left something raw. He saw it, and the sight took his breath for a beat. He kissed her. It was not soft. It was a kiss made of heat and air, and the need to hold on to anything that did not shift. Her hands bunched in the front of his shirt. She did not push him away. She pulled him closer, and the world narrowed until there was no room for a thought that did not have his name in it. A small sound rose from her throat and broke into a sob. He felt it through his mouth and stopped like a man finding the edge of a cliff he did not see. He lifted his head and let her wrists go and put his hands on her shoulders as if he were holding up more than bone. "I will not touch you like that again," he said. "Not until there is no fear in you. Not of me. Not of any of them. When you say yes with nothing under it but yes. If that day comes, it will be yours to name." She stood for a count, breathing like she had run. Then she stepped away and covered her face with both hands and did not cry. She took them down and looked at him. The shake had gone. She looked smaller and she looked stronger. He had seen men look like this at a river ford when they chose to cross because standing on the bank had taken too much from them already. Her voice was hoarse. "Do not die for me," she said. He shook his head. "I do not know how to live any other way than this," he said. She turned and left the frame without another word. He followed to the threshold and stopped there. The night had cleared, and the stars hung low and very bright. Far off, a coyote called once. Down in the scullery yard, the thin ribbon of smoke had gone to a thread, then disappeared. He went back inside and sat with his hands open on his knees and forced his breath to slow. The wind came down off the ridge and found the corners of the half-built room and made a sound like a low chord on a fiddle. He listened until it turned into just wind. Rain had rinsed the day clean and left the night sharp. The scullery held a steady glow, the kind that comes when a fire has found its breath. Wren sat on the bed edge and unbraided her hair with slow hands. The room smelled of wool and pine, and the faint sweetness of dried apples. Cricket shuffled in the lean-to and settled. The world felt held in a small circle of light. A different smell slid under the door, sour and thin, like a wick snuffed too late. Kerosene. It threaded through the warm scents and did not belong. Wren stood. The firebox breathed once. Flame licked at the jamb of the outer door, a thin line that brightened as she watched. A voice carried from the yard, too calm for the hour. "Fire cleans," Pastor Whitlock said. Another voice rough with pleasure called from farther off. "Burn it!" The outside erupted. Light ran along the old ribs of the main house. It found the places where resin had pooled in the beams and woke them in a low rush. Heat pressed against the scullery wall. Sparks lifted past the shutters like quick stars. Ezra was on his feet before the words found sense. He pulled Wren to the wall away from the door and put his body between her and the light. The rifle lay where he had set it under the table. He took it up and looked at the door again. Flames climbed the plank seam and dropped bits of blackened pitch that hissed when they hit the hearthstone. "Back wall," he said, "where the scullery meets the ruin." She grabbed his arm. "They are in the yard." He moved to the rear wall and set his palm on it. The timber gave a little where age had taken it. He reached for the axe by the woodpile, swung once, then again. The sound of iron on old pine cracked through the tight room. Splinters leaped. Smoke came in low, through the new gaps bringing the smell of burned dust and something oily. Wren pulled blankets from the bed and threw one around her shoulders. She found Ezra's duster on the peg and pushed it at him. He shook his head and threw it back over her, heavy and smelling of horse and rain. Outside, men shouted. Boone Sutter's broken voice rasped a cheer. Another flame broke against the wall as a thrown torch hit and stuck. Fire ran in a quick sheet where kerosene had soaked into old wood years before and waited for this moment. Ezra widened the hole until there was a black mouth into the skeleton of the main house. He shouldered through dragged boards free with his hands and cleared space enough for Wren to crawl. He turned and pushed her toward it. "Go." She hesitated, looked at the door that had kept her alive for years, and then put her hands on the edges and went into the char. The world went dark and hot and smelled like past rain steamed out of old soot. Ezra came behind with the rifle and the strap of the saddlebags across his chest. He pressed her forward until her fingers found the open yard beyond the ruin, and cold air hit her face. They came up into the clearing on the far side of the dead house. The night was loud. Fire roared like a river. Torches bounced in hands. The scullery door had gone to a frame of orange. Shadows of men swung and shortened on the ground. Whitlock stood apart with his book held high, his face bright with reflection. "Behold," he said, and his voice rolled, "cast out the rot, clean what remains." No one looked at the back of the ruin. Men were fixed on the front door and the thought of what would rise from it. Wren pulled the duster tighter and started to run. Ezra grabbed her elbow and checked her. "Horses," he said. They sprinted to the lean-to. Cricket threw her head and blew. Bay danced eyes, white hooves thudding the stall boards. Ezra cut both halters with one pull of his knife. He threw the blanket from the bed over Wren's shoulders and caught her waist. Up. She found the stirrup with her bare foot. The leather burned cold. He lifted and set her across the bay's back. She grabbed mane and hooked her knee behind the saddle horn. He vaulted up behind her and pulled her into him until she could balance. He clucked at Cricket, and the mule lurched into motion with a protesting bray that was almost relief. A shout went up as they broke from the shadow. A shot cracked and took bark from a young pine so close they felt the spray. Ezra turned the bay with his knees and went straight through the wide space between two men who had been brave one moment earlier and were now only surprised. He felt the horse take the ground and give it back. A second shot went wild and died in the fire's roar. They hit the creek crossing where stones lie like knuckles. Bay found them and hopped 1, 2, 3. Cricket came behind with the confidence of a creature that has been over the route 1,000 times. On the far bank, Ezra put the horse in the narrow trail that climbs to the shelf, the one he had walked 2 days earlier to see the lay. The night made the trees a dark hallway. Wren held to the horn and felt each stride in her teeth. Wind from the ridge carried the smell of burning up to them, then let it fall away. The voices lost edge and became only noise. Ezra listened past the rush of blood and rain. He found the sound of their own horseflesh and counted it. He felt the bay's shoulder under his leg and the power that still lived there. At the shelf, he turned left under a boulder that leaned like an elbow. He pushed along a game path to a little cut where the wind lays down most days. The stars were clear at that spot, a tight hole in the cloud. He slid from the saddle and lifted Wren down. She was shaking from cold and the last of the adrenaline. He took the duster and wrapped it around her again and set her against rock that still held the heat of the day. "Stay," he said. He took the lead and spoke into Bay's ear until the horse's breath settled. Cricket blew and rested her muzzle on Wren's shoulder for a moment, a weight of warm animal that grounded more than any word. Ezra tied both animals in the lee and came back with his knife and the habit of making shelter moving through his hands. He cut fir boughs and leaned them into a V between rock and fallen trunk. He wove smaller branches into the gaps until the wind could not come through in a straight line. He found stones and made a ring no bigger than a hat rim, then filled the bottom with gravel from the creek to keep the coals off the dirt. He went to his saddle and brought the tin of matches, struck one into cupped hands, and held it to a twist of birch bark he had saved, because he saves that kind of thing without thinking. The bark took, and the pitch in the fir cones took after that, and the coals came up to their own red. Smoke crept along the rock and lifted in a thin ribbon before the wind bent it away. Wren's hands had gone white. The blanket around her shoulders had collected a shower of fine charcoal. He held his palms a hand's breadth from her cheeks to warm the air she breathed. He set the pan at the edge of the flame and threw in a strip of meat from the pocket where he keeps it for hard miles. The smell of salt and fat laid itself over the sharper sense of the night. He looked at her. She looked back and did not ask questions that would only be answers they both had already. He reached for her wrist and put her hand between his and rubbed until the color returned. He did the same for the other. She let him. Her breath steadied. They ate with their fingers because there were no clean ways left. The meat went fast. He split the last crust in the saddlebag and gave her the larger piece. By the time the food reached her stomach, the worst shake was gone, and the space around them felt like a place and not only a hole in the dark. Wren lifted her face to the open strip of sky. The sound of the creek came up the draw as more of a feeling than a noise. She set the back of her head to the rock and closed her eyes. The lids were dark red with the fire on the other side of them. She opened them again and looked toward where the scullery would be on the other side of the ridge. She pictured the bench her father had made, and the needle on the table, and the journal with the corner worn smooth. The picture was as solid as the stone under her, and then it was gone under the knowledge of flame. Her jaw worked once as if to speak to something that would not answer. She did not speak. Ezra added a cone to the fire and watched it catch. He took off his coat and put it over her legs where the blanket had lifted. He kept the duster around her shoulders even though it meant the night sat harder on his own skin. He moved closer until his shoulder touched hers, not to fill a space that was not his, but to let her body take the heat that passes between two people who have both been out in too much night. She leaned into him after a moment, a small, honest weight. Far below, light still rose and fell in the place where the town held itself upright with voices. Up here, it was another country. Wind came down off the ridge and smelled of snow it had not yet seen. The fire ticked. Cricket breathed like a bellows. Bay stamped once and settled. Wren pulled the blanket higher and turned her face into the coarse wool. She was very tired, the kind of tired that comes when fear finally lets go. Ezra kept his eyes open until his breath and the horses matched. He watched the small flame hold to its ring and the smoke climb thin and straight before the wind took it. He let the night pass the way a stream passes, always moving real, only where it touches you. He put his hand over Wren's in the blankets and felt the slow rise and fall of sleep take her. The rock behind them kept its warmth for a while yet. The shelter held. Morning slid down the rock in thin sheets of light. Frost rimed the needles that had fallen near the shelter. The fire in the hat rim of stones was a shallow bed of coals dark red under ash. Ezra pinched one with 2 sticks and fed it a sliver of birch bark. The flame found itself and rose to the size of a thumb. Wren woke as if she had been listening to it the whole time. Her eyes were open without a start. The duster held the night's cold where it had not touched her skin. She pushed it back and sat up. The rock at her shoulders had kept its warmth, and now gave it back. She did not speak. She looked toward the ridge as if sight could carry through pines and over stone to the yard below. Her mouth was set in a way that made it look smaller. The air smelled clean edges of pitch and wet dirt and the faint bitter of last night's coffee. Ezra poured water into the pan. He set it near the coals and watched the skins stir. The horses shifted in the lee. Cricket rolled an eye and bumped her halter, then stood again. He turned to Wren. "I am going to look," he said. "There is a man in town who sees what others do not have the stomach to see. Old Finch. He stays behind the forge when the air goes cold. Wren's hands tightened under the blanket. Her jaw worked once. She nodded. Her eyes did not leave the ridge. Ezra wrapped the panhandle in a rag and set it aside. He pulled his coat on and slung the rifle. He stepped out of the shelter and stood for a breath with the light on his face. Then he went down among the trees. The path he chose was not the road. It was a line of deer yews and old survey cuts. Fern brushed his knees and left wet marks on his pants. The creek gave him a way to keep time. He moved quick at first, then slower when the ground thinned into open places, where a man showed more than he liked. He kept the rifle slung and his hands empty. The sun climbed. The damp came off the needles and rose as a smell like green wood split. Cinder Ridge came into view through a curtain of willow that held the last of its leaves. Smoke rose from kitchens and from the blacksmith's long hood. The church door sat open and took light the way a cave does. Ezra stayed in the alley between the livery and the back of the store. He stepped around a broken chair and a lot of old ash. He skirted the window where a curtain moved when it should not have. He went straight to the shade behind the forge. Old Finch lay in a lean-to made of boards and tin that might have been part of a crate once. The smell reached Ezra first. Sickness and sour whiskey and a wet wool blanket that had seen too many nights. Finch was awake. His eyes were watery and pale with a yellow ring near the white. His ribs made a line of hills under the blanket. He held a rag to his mouth and coughed into it, then folded it small and hid it under him like a secret he did not want to share. "I told them nothing," Finch said. The voice came thin and stopped to rest between words. "I do not want my throat opened." "I am not the pastor," Ezra said. He crouched beside the lean-to and kept his hands where Finch could see them. "I need truth. You can sell lies any place in town. Truth is a rarer trade." Finch's eyes slid to the side and found the end of a bottle that was not there. Ezra took a small flask from his pocket and set it within reach. Finch lifted a hand that shook and took it. He did not drink. He held the flask like it weighed 5 pounds. His fingers whitened. "What do you want?" Finch asked. The rag moved under him when his chest tried to cough again. "The night of the first fire," Ezra said. "The Calder house. Amos still breathing when the flames took the roof. Who was there?" Finch's jaw worked. He took a breath like he had to pull it in with a rope. His eyes went somewhere that was not this alley. He spoke as if the words needed a path and he had to lay it in front of them. "I slept under Caro's porch that night," Finch said. "Rain had a way of finding me. Voices woke me. Amos shouting. Fraud. He used that word like it was a stick. Caro begged him soft. Said he would make it right. Pastor told him to hush himself or be hushed. Then they went. I thought that was the end of it." Finch closed his eyes, opened them, and looked at his own fingers as if they might know how to go on. "One came back," he said. "Boone." He carried a tin that smelled like the railroad lamps. He went to the side of the house where the scullery sits. He poured it along the beam, and it ran like a wet candle. He struck a match on his belt. It hissed to life. He stood away and let the beam do the rest. Finch coughed, and the sound cut him in half. He pressed the rag to his mouth. When he pulled it away, a small red bloom showed, and then turned brown. "Thomas Vickers," Ezra said. "Red ladder, did Boone lay hands on him?" Finch nodded once. Thomas had a mouth that could sell snow in July. He kept going up where the ground ends. Boone followed him like a dog follows a wagon. No hurry, no sound. Thomas looked at the sky instead of the ledge. Boone set a palm to his shoulder, and that was that. "Sam Hargreave," Ezra said. Ezra said. Finch looked toward the forge wall. He licked dry lips. Sam shot straight, and he kept his traps clean. Boone knew his ground. He walked into the bear's bed early and left a haunch where a man would put his foot. A shot too close and angry. After that, the bear found what it found. And the curse, Ezra said. The word felt cheap in his mouth. Finch laughed once. It was a hard, small sound that left him weaker. From the pulpit, he said. Pastor's voice sweet as sugar. He wrapped it around the town like a shawl. Said the girl was marked. Said, look what happened to the boys who gave her a minute. Said God shows his mind in signs. Folks like signs. They let you put sense where there was only mean. Ezra set his hand on the lean-to's post and felt splinters bite his skin. Finch watched his face, as if the changes there were more news than the words. You done? Finch asked. I am out of wind. Ezra set a small wrapped bundle on the board near Finch's shoulder. Biscuits from his own bag and a slice of pork folded in cloth. Finch looked at it like it was a joke, and then took it with hands that remembered to be hungry. Thank you, Ezra said. Do not thank me, Finch said. I did nothing when it was time to do anything. I hid in a trough. I went under the whitewash and kept my breath in a tin. It is a habit now. Ezra stood. Finch looked at the shadow that Ezra threw on the ground. He lifted the flask and tried to drink and managed it this time. Ezra walked back through the thin lanes where the backs of the buildings make their own town. He took the creek bed out. The water came to his boot tops where it bent around a rock. Wren was where the shelter fell open to light. She had pulled the duster tight again, and her hair lay in the crooked line it took after sleep. Her eyes were clear and hard. She did not stand when he came in. He sat beside her and told her the words Finch had laid out, slow and careful not to make them larger or smaller than they were. When he said the word kerosene, she looked past him and saw something that was not here. Her mouth opened and then closed. "I smelled it," she said. "Not last night, before. In the wood where you cannot wash it. A little. It was there, and I made it into a ghost." She pressed her hand to the rock behind her, as if she needed it closer. She swallowed. Ezra waited. "I heard them," she said. "The first time. My father's voice made the wall shake. Fraud." She said the word without heat. She said it like it had letters cut into it. He knew the land was not theirs to sell. He said papers. He said Cheyenne. The pastor said quiet, or be quieted. I lay in my bed and counted my breaths. I did not go. I did not stand up. I went small. Ezra did not reach for her. He set his hand near hers on the rock so the skin of his knuckles almost touched her knuckles. He waited again. The fire made a sound like sugar poured slow. She turned her hand and set it on his. The touch was light and felt like it might be only the heat. Then she curled her fingers and held on. A long breath ran out of her and left her shoulders lower. He took his journal from his coat. It had swelled a little where Rain had found it once. The corner was bent from being in and out of his pocket in too many places. He tore a page from the back with care not to pull the stitching. He held the stub of pencil in fingers that were good at other tools and made the letters square. He wrote names. He wrote places. Red Ladder, Gallatin, Caro's Porch, Forge Yard. He wrote the sentence that Finch had laid down about the match on the belt and the tin that smelled like the railroad. He did not dress it. He kept it plain. Wren watched the point move. She took her own journal from under the blanket with a motion that had no wasted part. She opened it to a page where the margin held a small stain that might have been from cutting onions. She wet the pencil with her tongue and set it down and began. She wrote a date, the one that had hung from every line of her life like a weight. She wrote the hour as far as she could remember it. The sky had been a certain color, and the wind had carried the smell from the forge if you stood in the yard. She wrote that too. She wrote her father's words, and who else had been there, and which way their boots turned when they left. She wrote what she had not told anyone with her mouth. Ezra folded his page and wrote a name on the outside. Jonah Ellery. He wrote a town. St. Louis. He placed the folded sheet in the inside pocket of his coat, where it would sit near his ribs. He looked up. Wren was still writing. The pencil made a neat dry noise. Her hand did not shake. When she finished the first page, she did not read it back. She turned the page and kept going. She named the river and the rope and the raft and the hat lost in the eddy. She named the trapline and the bear bed and the meat left wrong on purpose. She named a ridge and the way a boot can push a man who is looking up. She wrote until the pencil pinched her fingers. Then she set it down and covered the journal with her palm, as if it had turned into something that might blow away. Outside, the wind lifted and set down again. The fire sank and had to be encouraged. Ezra set a cone on it and watched the pitch smoke turn into flame. Wren leaned her shoulder into his. She breathed like someone who had been climbing and finally stopped. The horses stood with their heads low. Cricket flicked an ear, a small answer to a question that had not been asked. Ezra looked at Wren. She looked back, and there was a piece of the old light in her eyes that the town had not put there and could not take. She slid the journal toward him an inch and then took it back and drew it to her chest. She shook her head once. He nodded. The point did not need saying. He took the needle from his pocket where he had put it on habit and sewed the torn edge of his sleeve with 2 quick stitches, a thought given shape by motion. Wren watched his hands, then took the needle from him and set the seam right with smaller steps. She bit the cut thread and smoothed the cloth. The day leaned toward afternoon. The flame held and threw a thin line of smoke up along the rock until the wind found it and laid it flat. The basin had a name only the two of them used: Starfall. The wind dropped there more often than it rose. Rock shouldered the worst of the weather. A creek ran through the middle with a sound that kept time even when the light failed. Ezra put the folded page in an inner pocket where he could feel it when he breathed. He checked the bay's feet tightened a knot and looked at Wren. She stood at the mouth of the shelter with the duster over her shoulders and the rifle across her forearms. Her face held the cold without complaint. "I will ride the flats," he said. "There is a rail agent's shack south with a box. I can be there and back by first light." Wren nodded once. She did not ask how far. She pressed the journal flat on her palm and held it out. He slid the page inside and felt the leather warm under his hand. "Bring the horse back in one piece," she said. He touched the brim of his hat and swung up. The bay took the slope like he had learned it in a hurry. Ezra looked once at the line of fir boughs and the small hat rim of stones. The smoke that rose from it was a thin pencil that fell flat before the ridge. He put the horse into the timber, and the basin swallowed him. Wren listened to the sound of hooves until the wind took it. Then she set the rifle butt to the ground and the barrel against her shoulder and stood in the door until the cold made her jaw ache. She went inside and set the fire, so it breathed without telling on them. She pulled a coil of snare wire from Ezra's kit and walked the creek edge. She set 3 loops where rabbit tracks showed, as commas in the damp sand. Her fingers lost feeling and then found it again. When she came back, the light had bled out of the sky. She ate a heel of bread and a strip of meat and wrote until her hand cramped. Names, dates, the things that hold up a story when wind leans on it. She did not write about fear. The creek kept talking. Cricket shifted where the wind could not find her. Wren laid the rifle across her knees and watched the gap where starlight showed. When she finally lay down, she kept the rifle within reach and the duster around her shoulders. Sleep came when it decided to. Ezra pushed the bay hard over the open country and kept the creek on his left until open turned to scrub, and scrub turned to hard pan. The track to the rail line was a scratch the color of old bone. A lantern burned in a box on a post at the shack. He fed the folded sheet into the slot and listened for the scrape of it settling. He stood for a count. A train labored far off, more felt in the ground than heard. He put his hand to the pocket where the letter had been and found only the heat it left. He turned and took the dark back in pieces. He reached starfall before the first blue got into the sky. The shelter held a low, dark shape that smelled of smoke and fur and a little of wool. Wren was awake before he spoke, rifle in her hands, and the sight on him, and then not. He set the rifle aside and crouched by the coals and made them take. She poured water into a pan and set it where the heat licked. Neither of them said a thing that asked for more than an answer the fire could give. Morning came white at the edges. They settled into a work that did not belong to town or to anyone's story. Ezra walked out before sun and came back with rabbits flopping against his belt. He stripped the ben with a knife he liked and did not talk about. Wren skinned and cleaned and set the meat high where air could take it and not the flies. She boiled bones and set fat aside in a tin. She learned the sound a loop makes when it holds. She learned how high to hang a net of twine, so meat dries without shouting smoke. They washed clothes in the creek where a flat stone made a good board. The water was so cold it felt like heat that could not decide. Wren's knuckles went red and swelled. Ezra scrubbed with her and said nothing. Their hands knocked once in the water. They did not pull away fast. The cloth smelled like creek and iron and a little of the pine that had hung over them. They made a bed that belonged to no one but the ground. Fir boughs laid thick, blanket over that. Ezra cut a second layer when the first had flattened and lost its spring. The shelter roof sang low when the wind pushed over it. Smoke walked the rock and slipped out flat. They ate in a way that made each meal count. They spoke when there was something worth the breath. On the second week, the sky closed and the world went white without a sound. Snow fell slow and thick at first, then small and hard. It packed in the seams and made the shelter a hive. They moved as if the air could break. Ezra kept the fire the size of a fist and fed it often. The wind threaded the fire's smoke, laid it along the rock, and took it into a fold. He set his back to the opening. Wren set herself next to him so their shoulders touched. When night came, there was no difference but a deeper hum. Cold found places that had seemed safe in daylight. Wren shook despite the blanket and the duster and the small fire that would not be more. Ezra did not speak. He pulled her across and set her back to his chest and wrapped his arm over her middle and his coat over both. She went still because still held heat better. Her breath climbed the ladder of his fingers and warmed them. He kept the line between warmth and want, clean because he had said he would. She slept at last with her hand tucked under his coat and her fingers against his ribs. His heart knocked there, and the sound of it made a measure that was different from the wind. Morning had pressed itself into the dark, like fat into cloth. They ate little, the last of the bread, a cup of broth each. Ezra melted snow in a cup and passed it to her. It tasted like the inside of a stone. By afternoon, the storm broke to a steady fall. Wren rose and stepped out into the white. The world had become a plain with only three things that did not hide: the rock, the shelter, and the single fir that leaned on the wind as if listening. She stood under it and lifted her face until flakes melted on her mouth. When she came back in, she was laughing under her breath. Ezra looked up from the small fire, and the sound changed his face by a fraction. She shook snow out of her hair and set the duster open. He reached for the blanket and straightened it over her shoulders as if that were a task he was meant for. They ate the last of the meat they could eat without thinking about what would come after. Wren sat with her knees up and her chin on them. Ezra took out his journal and turned to a page where a corner had torn. He sharpened the pencil with his knife and began to draw. He did not look at her as much as he looked at the work. Lines laid along lines until the rough shape became a person. Wren saw herself appear on the paper. Not the girl in the scullery window, not the quiet ghost that had learned to turn invisible. A woman with hair pushed back any way it would go, with a mouth that had learned how to say what it meant with hands that were not soft. "You see too much," she said. "Not enough," he said, and kept the point moving. He added the smallest detail of a needle caught in the collar of her shirt, where she had set it down and forgotten it. He sat back, then looked again, then nodded once. He tore the page out and handed it to her. "Keep it," he said. "The journal will tell its own story without a face." Wren took the paper. She held it with both hands as if it could tear from being looked at. She did not thank him. The word would have been wrong. She rolled the paper and slid it into the journal with the testimony. It made a soft sound when it found its place. Snow stacked along the edge of the shelter until it made a low wall. The wind shifted and brought the smell of balsam with it. Cricket buried her nose in her flank and groaned. Bay worked his jaw and blew. Ezra stepped out, brushed snow from both with his palm, and cleared their breathing so they would not ice their own air. He fed them from the last of the oats. The sound of their teeth was the best sound in the world for a few minutes. That night they lay close again, not because of hunger or fear, though both sat nearby. Wren turned toward him and set her palm on his throat, where the pulse runs. He looked at her and found no shake in her face. She moved closer and put her mouth on his. The kiss was slow and clean. It was not asking for more than it took. He answered it with the care of a man who has held a thing that can break, and learned that his hands are both the danger and the safety. The fire made a small sound that was not quite a sigh. When they pulled apart, they lay with foreheads touching, and spoke in low breaths that did not carry. "You are warm," she said. "You are alive," he said. Outside, the storm ran out of itself. The air turned clear with a blue that comes only when snow is new. In the morning, the basin looked larger because every line had been simplified. They ate what they had, and then they worked as if that were the only rule the place asked them to keep. Wren set a line of snares and found 2 prints where there had been none the day before. Ezra followed a set of tracks into the edge of the spruce and came back with a grouse heavy enough for a day and a half. He cleaned it fast and quiet. She plucked it slow and neat. The shelter smelled a little like wet feathers until the smell of meat took over. They sharpened the axe and cut more fur. Wren learned where to place her feet so the swing bit and not bounce. Ezra watched her stance and said little. He moved in after every 4th cut and pared the notch so the next stroke had a place to live. They worked until the light changed on the ridge. They carried wood in together and stacked it so air could move and dryness could happen. Her hands did not mind being raw. They felt like proof. Ezra took a coin from his pocket when the light went and laid it on his palm. A silver peso with a hole in the edge where years of riding had worried it. He rubbed his thumb across the head that had worn almost smooth. Wren watched the coin move under his hand without asking. He closed his fingers and slid it away like a habit. That night, they did not speak much at all. They ate, they cleaned the little pan they set the coals for the long hours. Ezra lay on his back for a time and looked through the slit where the stars sat in their windows. Wren turned on her side and tucked her hand under his arm so her knuckles rested against his chest, just above the steady. His breath slowed, hers joined it. The shelter gathered their heat and kept it. The creek spoke to the rock, and the rock held its tongue. The smoke rose in a thin line and then lay down flat. The mule came first ears like Flag's breath puffing in pale bursts. The rider sat stiff in a dark wool suit and a city hat that had lost its shape to weather. He turned into Starfall with care heels, out knees wrong for a saddle. He saw the shelter and the 2 shapes by the fire and lifted a hand as if he had walked into a parlor. "Jonah Ellery," he said, teeth chattering once before he caught them. "I received a letter." Ezra rose and took the mule's lead. He steadied the animal with a hand on its jaw the way he did for anything that had to learn new ground in a hurry. Wren lifted the pot from the coals and poured the last of the coffee. She handed the tin cup over without ceremony. Jonah wrapped both hands around it and drank. The heat hit his eyes and they closed for a breath. When he opened them, they were steady. "You look like St. Louis," Ezra said. "You look like the end of a road," Jonah said. He set the cup down and accepted the journal Wren held out. He did not sit. He stood under the cut rock where the smoke slid and read page to page with only his breath marking his place. His mouth moved when he read certain lines, names, dates, the way a man remembers the shape of a lie by the seams it cannot hide. He closed the journal and rested a palm on its cover. "It is clear," he said. "Cold water, clear." He looked at Wren, then at Ezra. "We go now." Ezra saddled the bay. Wren threw the duster over her shoulders and cinched it tight. Jonah mounted the mule again like it might be his first time and set his jaw against the jolt. They rode out of Starfall with the creek to their right and the sky thin between branches. By the time they reached open ground, the sun drew a pale edge on the bluffs. The town sat small and hard in the middle distance. Cinder Ridge noticed them before they turned down the main street. Curtains stirred. A man finished tying a bundle to a wagon with hands that did not need the rope that long. The church door gaped. The bell rope moved once and then was still. Ezra rode straight to Ned Caro's store. He swung down without hurry. Wren slid from Cricket and put a hand to the mule's nose when it bobbed at a hitch post. Inside, the air was warm and sweet with molasses and old flour. The stove ticked as iron settled. Ned stood at the counter with a ledger open but no pen in hand. Pastor Whitlock leaned against a barrel collar, white as bone, Bible tucked under his arm. Ephraim Dodd from the bank had a hand in his vest and a face that knew how not to show what it thought. Boone Sutter stood in the back, the bruise in his throat a deep yellow that told its own story. The bell on the door gave a civil ring. The three of them stood in the doorway, and for a moment the store felt like a stage where no one knew their lines. Ezra said nothing. He stepped aside. Jonah took one more breath of the warm air and then used it. "My name is Jonah Ellery. I am an attorney at law. I am here on behalf of the estate of Amos Calder and on behalf of Miss Wren Calder, whose person and name have been made a party to crimes not of her making." He set his gloved hand on the counter like he was placing a document there, even though it was empty. Whitlock lifted his chin. "This is a house of trade, sir, not a courthouse." Jonah looked at him as if he were an item on a shelf he did not plan to buy. "We will do both," he said. He turned to Ned. "Mr. Caro, the federal charter that governs mineral rights on this ridge exists in the world. There is a copy in Cheyenne, another in St. Louis. Your deeds do not match it. Your filings are paper over air." He turned his head to Dodd. "The transactions you moved for Mr. Dodd and for the church were constructed on that air." Dodd's face did not move. His fingers closed on the edge of the vest and let go. He made a small noise in his throat, a test of voice that did not go anywhere. Jonah's tone did not rise. He did not push with words. He laid them down and left space around them. On the night Amos Calder died, kerosene was poured along the scullery beam of his home. A match was struck on a belt. The beam took. Mr. Sutter was seen with the tin and with the match. Mr. Caro arrived early the next morning to express sorrow and later sign papers that would never stand under light. Reverend Whitlock preached a story that quieted questions. The story sat on a girl's shoulders so none of you had to carry it. Whitlock smiled the way a man smiles when he has a line he knows will land. "Son, you have been lied to. This town knows God's will. It has seen signs. It has seen what happens when a stain is allowed to spread." Wren's voice came low and even. "Signs," she said. "You speak of signs like they choose you." Heads turned because she had not spoken in this room for years. Ned's hands twitched where he had set them flat on the counter. Boone shifted so the light did not hit his face. Dodd's weight settled into his heels as if the floor had moved. Ezra looked at Jonah. Jonah nodded once. Ezra took 2 steps to the door and pushed it wide with his palm. Air moved. Voices from outside reached in. The street was full. Men who had taken this road every day of their lives stood as if they had forgotten where they were going. Women held children back by the shoulders. Old Mrs. Albright stood in the center with her mouth open and her hands tight on her apron. Sheriff Kemp appeared at the edge and did not step closer. He watched like a dog that has seen the stick too often. Ezra put a hand on Ned's shoulder. "Out," he said. Ned moved as if pulled by a rope. Jonah did not hurry. He walked with them to the porch. Whitlock came because he could not afford not to. Dodd followed, with his face held in one piece. Boone waited half a beat, then slid along the back shelving toward the rear door. Ezra turned and looked at him. Boone stopped. On the porch the light was full. Ezra stepped down and looked at the faces. He did not speak. He moved aside. The space that made filled with a kind of silence that was not empty. Wren stepped forward. Her hat threw a small shadow over her eyes. She did not hold the journal. She held her hands together as if they were not sure what else to do. She stood where everyone could see her and where she could see everyone. "My name is Wren Calder," she said. The words sat on the air as simple as pins set into cloth. "My father was Amos Calder. He told men in this town that land was being stolen on paper. He said there were rights that did not belong to the hands that held them. He went to bed in a house that had not yet burned. In the night, someone poured lamp oil on the wood that keeps a house up. The fire ran where the oil told it to run." She looked at Boone and then at Ned. She looked at Whitlock last. The pastor did not blink. "After my father died, the pastor spoke in the church about signs," she said. "He spoke the word curse. He spoke it to save his friends from questions. He spoke it so that when boys drowned, and when a man fell, and when a bear did what bears do when they are trained wrong, it could be called God, and not what it was. People liked that. They liked having a name for something that was really only a hand behind a back." Mrs. Albright put both hands to her mouth. Her eyes filled. A sound started near the bank where Dodd stood and turned into a cough. It might have been a man clearing his throat. It might have been a piece of his soul trying to get out. Reverend Whitlock found his voice. "You heed a harlot and a drifter," he said. "This is blasphemy." He lifted the Bible like it could make a wall. Jonah raised his hand to the crowd the way a teacher calms a room. He did not look at Whitlock. He looked at Ned Caro. "Mr. Caro," he said, "speak to your town. Lay your hand on the counter if you need to steady it. Tell them about the morning after the fire. Tell them about the papers Amos showed you. Tell them about the oil." Ned's lips opened and closed. His jaw made a small grinding motion, the grind of a man who has used lies like teeth for so long he does not know how to chew truth. He looked at the faces not one by one, but as a wall. He looked at Wren and his mouth trembled. "I told Boone to bring the papers," Ned said. He spoke like something heavy had been set on his chest. "I told him to go at night. I told him not to hurt anyone. He went back. He had the tin. He lit it. He said it went fast. He said it was God's sign. I took the papers. I gave them to the pastor. He said the town would need them." Whitlock did not move. His hands tightened on the leather of the book until the skin turned white. Ezra stepped onto the porch. He put the smallest pressure on Ned's sleeve, and Ned kept going, because there was nothing else his mouth could manage now. "Thomas Vickers," Ned said. "He talked too much." Boone followed him to the ridge. Amos had said the mine maps were marked wrong. Thomas had found his own way to the same truth. The ridge did what Boone told it to do. He set a hand and a push was enough. "Sam Hargreave," Jonah said. Ned closed his eyes. He lifts the words like a weight. Boone salted the bear's bed and left a haunch wrong. He fired the shot to wake something that should have been left sleeping. Sam was where that wake met a man. After that, Whitlock preached his story. He said the girl was tainted. He said God had marked her. He looked right at me when he said it. The sound that ran through the crowd was not one kind of sound. It had pieces. Shock, anger, the heavy quiet of people thinking through the years and seeing where the joints were. A woman put her hand on her boy's head and did not know she had done it. A man who had worked for Dodd took his hat off without meaning to. Sheriff Kemp stepped up onto the first stair. Reverend Whitlock lifted his arms. "This is a mob," he said. "This is sin made public." He tried to make his voice fill the street. It did not. Jonah did not look at him. He turned to Ephraim Dodd. "The bank papers," he said. "The filings. The instruments on the mine ground north of here. You will release them to the marshal in Cheyenne. You will also release them to me." Dodd worked his tongue against a tooth. He made a motion with his hand like he was brushing lint. He had two choices and both were bad. He picked the one that let him breathe. "You will have them," he said. His voice had no more oil in it. Boone found his courage first because he knew what men like him always know. If he moved fast enough, he could get out. He slid along the line of the porch posts and put a foot in the dust. Ezra's head turned the way a bird's does when it hears a small thing at a distance. Boone made 3 steps. Sheriff Kemp drew, and for once did not shoot the ground. The report snapped off the buildings, and Boone stopped without being shot. Kemp's hand shook. He set his jaw the way a man does when he is late to his own life and knows it. "Boone Sutter," Sheriff Kemp said, "you are under arrest for arson and for murder." He swallowed. He lifted his chin. Reverend Whitlock, you too. Mr. Dodd, Mr. Caro, step down off that porch. Whitlock stared at Kemp as if he had not understood the language. He opened his mouth to say God again. The word did not help him this time. He lowered the Bible an inch. Then he lowered it the rest of the way. He stepped forward. Kemp took his arm, and the touch sent a thin shock through the crowd. It was not justice. It was at least the start of something that could sustain weight. Wren stood with the duster wrapped around her and watched men who had shaped her life without touching her now put their hands out for cuffs. Ned wept without sound, like a pipe that leaks behind a wall. Dodd looked at the bank door as if it were a friend that had failed him. Boone stared at Ezra, and then at the ground, and then at the place his feet were about to go. Whitlock looked at no one at all. Mrs. Albright took 2 steps and reached for Wren. Her hands stopped short. Her eyes pleaded for something she could not name. Forgive, she said, and it fell out of her like a dropped plate. Wren looked at her, and then at the town. Skirts, boots, the barber with lather on one sleeve, the boy with straw hair who pointed at the chimney smoke every morning and got scolded for it. She did not feel the old heat. She did not feel nothing either. She spoke in a voice that was almost kind and had no softness in it. I do not have that for you, she said. Whatever you want, you will have to find somewhere else. Ezra put a hand at the small of her back, not to steer her, just to let his presence have weight where it could. Jonah stepped to the side so the sheriff and his prisoners could pass. Kemp moved them down the steps and across the street to the jail that did not hold much. The sound of keys and the scrape of the bolt felt like a workman's job, dull and necessary. The crowd opened. Wren and Ezra walked through it, faces parted and closed, and turned to follow and then turned away. No one reached. No one spat. No one called a name that was not hers. The wind came off the ridge and brought the smell of pine. The sun had crossed into a place where shadows went long and made everything look steadier than it had in months. They reached the horses. Jonah stood at the mule with a hand on its neck. He looked a little older than when he had ridden into Starfall that morning. He tipped his hat to Wren. Miss Calder, he said, the law can move when it has something worth carrying. Wren looked at him and gave the smallest nod. Ezra gathered the bay's reins. Cricket flicked an ear and looked at the road like she might have an opinion about it. The 3 of them turned their animals north. The street let them go. The sound of hooves found its rhythm. The bell did not ring. The sky held pale behind the red rock, and the light had that late afternoon clean that shows everything that is still standing. Spring came up the draw in slow greens. Snow slid off the firs, and the creek spoke faster, full of melt and stones. The rock faces lost their winter glare. Starfall felt wider, as if the valley had taken a breath it had held for months. A rider found the basin at noon, a young man with ink on his fingers and a dust coat that did not fit his shoulders. He led a tired horse and looked around like he had stepped into someone else's map. Miss Calder, Mr. Kane, he said, voice careful. I am from Mr. Ellery's office. Ezra took the reins. Wren wiped her hands on the duster and came from the shelter. The young man slid off and untied a leather satchel. He set it on the table Ezra had built from a windfallen plank and a pair of sawhorses. The satchel buckles clicked. Paper came out thick and official. He read without drama. Cheyenne Court, he said. Indictments and findings, Boone Sutter and Reverend Whitlock guilty of arson and murder, Ephraim Dodd and Ned Caro guilty in the fraud. Sentences named and signed. He looked up. Your father's name is cleansed on record. He lowered his eyes to the last page. There is compensation awarded, $10,000. Funds seized from the conspirators to be paid to you. The creek went on talking. Ezra watched Wren's face. She stood still then, put a palm on the paper that said her father's name, as if the letters might be warm. Her throat moved once. Thank you, she said. Then she turned the money page back to him. I do not want that. Send it to an orphan house in Helena. Let it buy blankets and books. Let it feed children who do not have a roof. I will not keep a coin from what was taken. The young man stared lost between words and air. Ezra nodded to him and reached for the satchel. Wren signed where he showed, with a hand that did not shake. The rider left as late light lay long in the grass, his horse moving easier than when he had come. They built because hands need work. Ezra dropped trees where they would fall clean and cut them square with a broad axe that rang on the wood like a low bell. Wren learned to measure a notch with her thumb knuckle and set a log so its weight found the corner that would hold it. They hauled with a rope that burned their palms and knotted with 3 turns so the knot would bite and still come free. Sap stuck to their skin. Splinters found them. They pulled them out and kept going. Smoke rose from a new chimney once they had a hearth. The ribbon was not thin. It went up full and straight, a declaration a person could see from the ridge and know that here was a fire that belonged to someone who meant to keep it. Wren set a kettle on iron and listened for the first small sound it made when water begins to think about boiling. Ezra set a window in the east wall. Morning light came in clean and made squares on the plank floor. They planted a garden where the ground cupped a little out of the wind. Wren pressed beans into soil that smelled of melt and rot and seed. She strung a net for them and tied the knots tight, small squares that matched her stitching when she mended Ezra's shirt on the step in late sun. She ran her finger along a seam and felt it hold. One afternoon, a wagon came up from the lower country. It was Mrs. Albright with a quilt folded high in the back and a pot that had belonged to Wren's mother. She pulled up and sat there as if the reins had decided for her, her hands twisted on themselves. "I kept these when I should not have," she said. "I told myself I was saving them. I do not know what I was saving them from." Her voice thinned. "Can you ever forgive me?" Wren walked to the wagon and looked at the things. The quilt was heavy and bright with small pieces. The pot had 3 dents that were familiar as a face. Wren lifted both down and set them on the grass. "Thank you for bringing what was my mother's," she said. She did not move to take the woman's hands. She stood in her own yard with the smoke from her own roof in the air behind her. "I have work to do." Mrs. Albright's eyes filled. She nodded because there was nothing else to do, turned the team, and drove away slowly. The sound of the wheels faded easy to forget. When the roof was tight and the door swung on its leather hinges without argument, Ezra took the wagon and went to Helena to trade pelts and buy glass and seed, and a small iron stove that had a door that closed with a click he liked. He came back at dusk on the 6th day, the wagon heavy and the horse sweating, but he was not alone. A small boy rode on a sway-backed pony tied behind legs straight with effort, hands in the mane. The boy slid down stiffly when they stopped. He had eyes too big for his face and a way of not looking at the world straight on. Ezra gathered the reins and kept his voice quiet. "His name is Luke Tanner," he said. "Winter fever took his people up near the lake. The sisters in Helena were sending him east. He does not speak. He did not look like he belonged there." Wren crouched in the dust, so her eyes were level with the boy's, and put her hands on her knees. She did not reach out. "Hello, Luke," she said. "I am Wren. That is Cricket, and she is a mean old mule who likes carrots. If you are hungry, there is stew inside. If you are not, there is stew inside for later." Luke did not answer. He looked at her hands, then at the mule, then at the square of a house with 2 windows and smoke from a chimney. Wren waited. The boy lifted a hand that shook once and set his fingers in hers. She stood keeping the touch light and led him toward the door. Ezra took the pony's lead and followed. Days turned soft with work. Luke found a place on the step and learned to whittle without cutting himself. He followed Cricket as if she were a patient teacher and learned how to curry a coat until it shone. He slept under the heavy quilt and did not wake crying. Sometimes he stood with his palm on the wall as if listening to the house itself. Wren showed him how to turn earth with a hoe and how to set a bean without breaking the root's first reach. Ezra put a hand on the boy's shoulder once when a wide sound of wind came down the ridge, and Luke went still. The boy stayed still, then breathed again. The creek ran silver under sun. One late afternoon, Ezra said, "Come with me," and Wren took her hat and stepped into the saddle. They rode slow along the edge of the grass where small flowers had started like fingernail moons. They reached the bend where the water had held her while she came apart in the storm and then held her up. The aspens were new leaf and loud, with small green talk. Ezra took her left hand and looked at the callus that the needle had made where it rests. He held it like a man holds a tool he knows well. He spoke without dressing the words. "I am not a man with much. I have a roof we made, and a length of fence that stands up when the wind pushes, and a boy who watches how I move. I have this valley and the work it asks for. I want your name to sit next to mine in a way paper can recognize, and in a way no paper needs to." He reached into his pocket and brought out a small ring. Silver hammered smooth, the old head worn almost flat. There was a tiny nick where the coin's hole had been taken down and polished until it was only a memory you had to look for. "I carried this coin through places I do not care to name," he said. "I had a smith in Helena cut it and bend it. It is not gold. It is what I have." Wren held out her hand. She did not speak. The creak made the only noise. Ezra slid the ring over her finger. It fit as if it had been measured by the life she had lived up to now. She looked at it then, at him, and her eyes brightened in a way that did not need tears. "They called me cursed," she said. "It was not a question, and it was not a claim. It was a thing she set down between them, small now where it had once been large. Ezra brushed his thumb along her cheek where sun had left a line. He leaned in and kissed her. It was not a kiss of hunger or a kiss of rescue. It was quiet and complete. The wind moved through the aspen leaves, and they whispered. The light lay soft on the water. A hawk circled once and went its way. They rowed back as the creek took on the color of the sky. Luke sat on the step when they came into the yard, a small knife in his hand and a curl of wood at his feet. He looked up. Wren swung down and took his face in her palms and kissed his hair. She went inside and stirred the pot on the stove. Ezra pulled more wood to the wall and stacked it so air could move. Smoke from their chimney rose straight bright in the falling light and held. Thank you so much for listening to today's story. If this story resonated with you or made you reflect, I'd love to hear your thoughts, so feel free to share them in the comments below. And don't forget to like, subscribe, and hit the notification bell so you won't miss the next story.